Good afternoon and welcome to Orkney International Science Festival and Foraging Fortnight online. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be introducing this session. The Orkney International Science Festival is entering its 30th anniversary this year, and we are marking the occasion with our very first online festival. This year, we are delighted to bring a full festival programme directly to you, wherever you are at this moment. I'm joined here today by Reverend Julia Mason, webcasting from Kirkwall. Julia is the minister of two church congregations in Orkney, Kirkwall East and Shappensey. This afternoon, she will be setting the scene and introducing the main speakers who will be discussing the most interestingly named topic, beyond the world's meaning. If you have any questions for the speakers, please enter them in YouTube's live chat. We'll come back to these at the end of the talk. We hope you enjoy this event, and I now hand over to Julia.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to this session. This afternoon, we are going to be speaking about John Oman, an Orkney theologian who grappled with questions of the relationship between theology and science and had his own original perspective on the matter. Let me now introduce our two speakers. Howie Firth is a writer and broadcaster and director of the Science Festival. He studied mathematical physics in Edinburgh and has a deep interest in the history and philosophy of science. Patricia Long, née Leith, is a great-granddaughter of John Oman's brother Thomas. She lives in Stennis, just over the hill from Biggins, where the Oman boys grew up. She uses the internet and the local archives to put together stories of Orkney's interaction with the wider world. And this time she has family stories to draw on. In addition to these two distinguished guests, I would like to welcome two more, Neil Grott and Kenny Meeson, who will read to us from John Oman's writings and bring them to life. Without much further ado, I will hand over to Howie Firth. Howie.
Thank you very much, Julia. And much has been written about science and religion, and much quite forgettable, but very occasionally a real insight comes about. Here is the physicist Erwin Schrödinger in a 1950 Dublin lecture. He said, "I am born into an environment. I know not whence I came, nor whither I go, nor who I am. Our burning question as to the whence and whither, all we can ourselves observe about it is the present environment. That is why we are eager to find out as much as we can about it. That is science, learning, knowledge. That is the true source of every spiritual endeavor of man." Now, notice how Schrödinger starts off by our own experience, our own lack of knowledge, and how the search for knowledge then follows. And this is the language in which modern science took shape. The Greeks took philosophy a long way, but they built in a fundamental block. They split the universe into the heavens above and the earth below. They saw the heavens as perfect, with the earth an imperfect copy. The medieval church adopted this cosmology and emphasized the dominance of the heavens over the earth. This language of dominance went further back to the Roman Emperor Constantine. He wanted a state religion to hold the empire together, with the church's structure replicating that of the state. Philosophy and religion thus became entangled. Philosophical inquiry became narrowed down to seeking new interpretations from approved books. 400 years ago, a young Frenchman with a flair for mathematics reacted against this. From all the philosophy he had studied, he said, his main conclusion was that no two people could find anything to agree on. He wanted to find what people did when their lives depended on their decisions. So he left his books and went off to join the army. His name was René Descartes. He had trained at a Jesuit college and learned to use a sword and ride a horse. So off he went, with Europe about to erupt into the 30 Years' War. Snowbound in a German inn, he made a breakthrough. We must think, he said, with the same caution as a general scouting a battlefield. Make no assumptions, doubt and check all information, and carefully build up a picture from known quantities. Well, in terms of knowledge, this meant wiping the slate clean, clearing away the books, and starting afresh from direct experience. And from our own experience, we can see that the heavens above and the earth below are not opposites. They share one core feature, a location in space. That location can be represented by numbers. So Descartes brought heavens and earth together to form the world of matter, covered by a vast mathematical net. The consequence of Descartes' insight was immense. If heavens and earth are made of similar stuff, then we can interpret what we see in the skies through our practical observations down here on earth. That is the massive significance of Newton's apple falling. From the apple falling on Earth, he can deduce conclusions about what's happening with the movement of the planets up above. That's why he called his great work on gravity Principia Mathematica, Principles of Mathematics. It followed Descartes' own Principia Philosophiae, Principles of Philosophy. But if the heavens are brought together with the earth into a material world, where is a home for spiritual affairs? Descartes suggested it was within us, but he didn't pursue the matter far. He laid the foundations for Newton and the study of the material world in the following centuries of science, and he left the spiritual world for another day. Left within the spiritual world were some key areas such as life and consciousness. Anything, in fact, that's not material is left behind by this cut into the material and the non-material. Areas like life and consciousness cause difficulties for science today because it's not easy to apply measurement and mathematics to something like them that is not material. So Descartes' line needs to be crossed and the world on the other side explored. But to take it, we have to do what he did and start afresh. And remarkably, someone has already done this. A theologian close to 100 years ago who said the starting point for theology is not authority, as the medieval church had believed, but experience, to be investigated systematically in a search for the truth.
Unless theology is like true science, about experience and not in place of it, it is worthless.
And I can deduce that Neil said, and unless theology is like true science, about experience and not in place of it, it is worthless. Because I think Neil's microphone's off. But that's what was said. And what was said is exactly the language of Descartes, applied to the other side of the line he drew. It puts theology and science into a common framework and is arguably the biggest development in the relationship between them for 4 centuries. And the man who did it was an Orcadian connected to the Leisks and the Leiths in Stennis. But before I give his name, I must apologize to Neil because it's not Neil's microphone that's off. It's my speaker. At least I'm pretty sure. But the important thing is, regardless of technology, is the name of this man who did so much. The man we're going to speak about this evening. His name was John Oman, and his great-great-niece is Patricia Long.
It used to be said that Orkney's main exports were eggs and professors. In his book on Orkney, Hugh Marwick pointed out that 9 Arcadians who graduated from Edinburgh University around the turn of the century became professors, all scientists but one. Marwick suggested that this exception was the most distinguished of them all, as John Oman was one of the most influential theologians of his time. Stephen Bevans, in his PhD published in 1992, described John as coming from the dour, independent breed of Scottish crofters. But as you might guess from this picture, where John, third in a family of 6, is the tall one at the back, this gives a false impression. He was named after his great-grandfather, John Wood, master and part owner of a brigantine, and described by John Oman as possibly the last man in Stromness to wear a long waistcoat and silver buckles on his shoes. He grew up. John's mother, Isabella Rendell, grew up in the family home, the house built by her father, Magnus Rendell, in Graham Place in Stromness. I have managed to lose a page. And on the Oman side, they claim descent from John Oman of Brodgar, who was a member of the Scots archers in Paris, serving the King of France in 1469. And John's father Simon was a remarkable man on land and sea. He had inherited the farm of Biggins around about the time of his marriage in 1853. And under his stewardship, it grew from 60 acres in 1861 to 170 acres in 1871. But during this period, he described himself on his children's birth certificates as a shipmaster. He had gone to sea aged 16 and risen to be a master mariner. And for 5 years in the 1860s, he captained the Royal Mail, the ship that the forerunner to the Ola and the Hanro that sailed 6 times a week between Stromness and Scarbster. Young John could have stood at the door of Biggins on the hill overlooking the Bay of Ireland and looked across the family's field to watch his father's ship come into Stromness. John dedicated his second book to his father, whom he described as a scholar only of life and action, but my best teacher. Simon may not have been a scholar, but he was an active supporter of education. John won his first academic prize in 1867, when he was 7, at the Free Church School at Braeside, overlooking the present Stennis School, but it closed soon after that. A new school had been built just to the west. There are no pictures of the school, unfortunately, but you can see the schoolhouse built at the same time, behind the substantial farmhouse at Savedale. The decision to build a new school had been taken at a meeting in March in 1867, and Simon Oman had been the first to pledge money towards it. His £10 was more than a tenth of the total raised in the parish. He was also a member of the 6-man committee appointed to the project. The school opened just 9 months later. When compulsory education was introduced in 1872, the Stennis Madras School became the parish school, and the redoubtable Magnus Spence arrived to teach there in 1875. John's younger sister and brothers, Isabella, Simon and Thomas, are on the school roll, but 15-year-old John had already moved on. The family story that John and his brothers went to a tutor who lived in the double houses at Stromness that you can see here on the left had seemed unlikely until the census showed the retired Free Church minister from Stennis, Alexander Ritter, living there. The boys sailed themselves there across the Bay of Ireland and into the busy harbour. When someone suggested that this was too dangerous, Simon said the boat was there and he trusted the boys. No wonder John wrote in Grace and Personality that the true test of parental love is how the mother or father allows and challenges the child to grow in responsibility and freedom. Many years later, a colleague of John Oman's, F.G. Healy, noted that a portrait of Simon Oman hung above his son's desk, and Healy believed that this father-son relationship had a great influence on John Oman's view of God as a father figure. His parents continued to allow John this responsibility and freedom when they sent him to Edinburgh University. This may have been more in hope than expectation. It was said that as he showed no aptitude for farming or the sea, they couldn't think of anything else to do. He described himself later as a raw lad from the ends of the earth, with little equipment except a vast responsiveness to the intellectual environment. It turned out that this was all he needed.
His family background in Orkney comes through time and again in his writings. It brings a freshness to his thinking. He speaks of his faith as a security on the ocean and as something that is never to be won by hugging the shore. This was his attitude from early years, to recognize that you sometimes find the deepest insights in the toughest situations. This was what drew him into theology. He went to Edinburgh University to study philosophy, and he wondered about medicine to follow. But then a great religious controversy erupted. A brilliant young theology professor at the Free Church College of Aberdeen had written several biblical contributions for the Encyclopaedia Britannica's latest edition. His name was William Robertson Smith, and his approach to biblical texts was not to simply take them as fact, but scrutinize them with all the techniques of scholarship in language and history. There was a charge of heresy and a split in the church which resonated across the whole of the UK. By 1880, the case was dominating political discussion nationally. John Oman at Edinburgh had no interest in theology, but he started to read Robertson Smith's speeches and then heard him in person and was impressed. He felt that they both shared a passion for truth. And then he heard people declaring that even if Robertson Smith was right, he shouldn't have said it, out of respect for tradition and the church. That did it.
Had I been then attending the ministry, probably I would have put off it. But this affected me somewhat. It's a call to my life's work.
So, after graduating in philosophy at Edinburgh in 1882, he started studying theology. His reading included German theologians at the forefront of new thinking, and he studied for a summer at Heidelberg. Nearly 30 years later, he would find Britain and Germany embroiled in war.
When war broke out in 1914, John Oman volunteered as a chaplain in Cambridge and used his German in visits to internment camps. He went to France in 1915 and 16, working for the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. He worked near the front line, lecturing on the historical problems of the war and trying to answer the almost impossible questions from the soldiers. He visited hospitals, comforting patients and confronting the realities of war. As he worked, he was thinking about the war's implications for the Christian faith, and his book on the subject, Grace and Personality, was published in 1917. One reviewer urged his readers to buy the book, saying, "If you have no money, then sell your shirt." It came to be regarded as one of the great spiritual classics. His reputation as a theologian had begun in Alnwick in Northumberland, where he spent 18 years as a minister in the English Presbyterian Church. It had taken him a long time to find a parish, as he was not a born preacher, but he was very good at being a minister. When he left in 1907, one of his parishioners wrote, "In the beginning, no one could follow him, but by the time he left, we couldn't follow anyone else." The book he wrote 5 years earlier, Vision and Authority, had made such an impact that he was invited to make a lecture tour in America. He was offered teaching positions in the States and in Melbourne, but left Alnwick to become a professor at Westminster College in Cambridge. He spent the next 28 years there, becoming its principal in 1922. He's also a lecturer in theology at the university. He was made an honorary fellow of Jesus College. He was awarded doctorates by Oxford and Edinburgh universities and was made a fellow of the British Academy. This portrait by Hugh Goldwyn-Riviere, painted in 1933, hangs in Westminster College, and I'd like to thank them for permission to show it and for the image of the college.
John Oman uses a familiar image of Orkney to illustrate his starting point for theology of human experience.
Suppose yourself on a wide moorland without anything very distinctive at any time, in any direction, and in the dark, wholly without character or feature or visible landmarks, with the mist settling in the boggy hollows and a sombre heaven above, with too few stars for any one to be identified with certainty. If, being accustomed to such a situation, you are still calmly assured that you will reach home safely, and even directly, to what guidance are you trusting?
Well, he says, you can make out in the darkness the track beneath your feet made by others before you and follow it. But you can't rely on it completely, as there can be times when the path forks, and even a well-chosen path may not be the right one.
You have to take the risk of leaving it and faring forward as straight as you can, across such country as you chance to meet.
And now that you are relying on your own skills, you must watch every step to avoid soft, boggy ground. Even a little light from the sky can help for the horizon ahead.
There is one solitary star, the name of which you may not know, but the direction of which you can confidently trust. In loyalty to the authority of this double vision of the near and changing and the remote and abiding, you can make straight paths for your own feet and perhaps straighten out the task a little and make it a little plainer for those who may follow.
This image shows John Oman's approach. The wisdom of the past lays down a trail we can follow, but a time comes when we must start to work out a path for ourselves. And out of our own experience comes a feeling for signs to follow. This is his huge breakthrough. He broke with 2 millennia of theology shaped by authority. He was quite specific about this. Religion, he said, is not a kind of trade union to impose upon mankind merely traditional beliefs. His first principle of theological method was that it must be open to all honest inquiry. Its role is interpreting the religious dimension of human existence. This enables him to compare theology with science. Both of them, he said, seek to understand reality. Science focuses on the world of the senses, homing narrowly on its object. Theology asks the meaning beneath the world and looks at its unity. So science and theology explore the same world, but in different ways. Science, he says, looks backward at experience. Theology searches for the meaning of the whole and thus looks forward.
Theology reaches out beyond the world's larger meaning, while science concerns itself with origins and uniformities. The whole attitude of truth knows no limits.
So, putting it all together, John Oman has taken the second of 2 great steps in the structure of knowledge. René Descartes took the first step 400 years ago, separating out the material world and creating the foundations for the scientific method of exploring it through building on experience and testing for truth. John Oman has extended Descartes' thinking to the spiritual world, and he should therefore be recognized as one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. His family, remember, a very fine, warm-hearted man.
My Aunt Joyce worked in Manchester in the 1930s and remembered visiting the Oman family in Cambridge. John had met and married Mary Blair in Alnwick. Joyce said that Mary Oman made the impressive principal's house in Cambridge a warm and welcoming home. They had men who were students there tell how every Sunday evening after church they would make their way to the drawing room, sit at Uncle's feet, admire his daughters and enjoy Auntie's sandwiches and cakes. No wonder 2 of his 4 daughters, Jean and Isabel, became ministers' wives. You can tell from his writing how much John Oman loved Orkney, and he visited it as often as he could. The crossing the Pentland Firth could be challenging. Describing a crossing in a heavy swell, he wrote,
The most convincing proof I ever gave that I was a man of my word was to go into the forecastle to see after a woman with 5 children. to whom I had rashly promised someone on the pier to lend a helping hand. The whole 6 of them were huddled on the floor beyond human aid. The expedition of my retreat did not prevent me from spending the rest of the time on a coil of rope, limper than the end of it.
He must have welcomed the chance to visit again the landscape that he loved, that had been such an influence on him, and that was so different from Cambridge. He wrote,
When you're in Orkney and see the land and water intermingled, the sea a perfect azure, and the hills every shade from brilliant green to dark brown and purple, and gaze without interruption from horizon to horizon. Watch the changing shadows cast by the brilliant white light and breathe the vast air. You begin to understand the cry of the old woman, "Oh, let me to the water, I'm being choked by the trees."
this picture was taken on his last visit in 1937. He had preached in the Victoria Street Church, which he remembered so well, and crossed the street to have lunch with his niece Kate and her family, who lived in his mother's old home in Graham Place. My mother Catherine is the little girl pulling down her sleeves. The lady to his right is his widowed sister, Isabella Irvine. John's wife Mary had died a year before this photograph was taken, but Bella and his daughter Mary, a social worker, lived with him. In his retirement, John Oman was a keen gardener and was busy planting up vegetables during one of Joyce's visits. She is the one in the smart hat. His daughter Mary kept reminding him that he had an important dinner to attend at Trinity College that evening, and finally ordered him into the house to get ready. Very soon after, they had the front door close. Mary jumped up, saying that he couldn't possibly have got ready in that time. She raced out and found her father heading for the college in his old gardening clothes, with a bundle under his arm. Mary showed Joyce the bundle. It was his Doctor of Divinity robe, still tied up in a pair of braces, as he'd carried it to a conference in London the week before. A conference was held on John Oman at Westminster College in 2009, and it resulted in a book, John Oman, New Perspectives. Reading it, I discovered how much he had in common with those other scientific Arcadian professors. First, in his fresh approach to how science and religion could coexist. In an essay in 1916, he noted that the conception of the atom itself had changed very much in recent years, and that the new idea left measureless room for the possibilities of the universe. But most of all, he shared with them a vast curiosity about the world and a desire to share his discoveries. In my researches into his contributions to the wider world, it has struck me that one of our main exports is common sense. So I was pleased to read this quote from a review of another of John Oman's books, The Natural and Supernatural.
It has been said to me that no one can understand Dr. Oman aright, who does not see him standing on the prow of a Viking ship with the wind and the salt spray blown around him. Certainly, there in his thought a robustness, a freshness, a virility and venture which smack of the sea and of heroic enterprises. There is breadth, a wholesomeness, a common sense, which is infinitely refreshing to readers of ordinary theological and devotional literature.
Although John Oman died in 1939, I still meet people who've come to Orkney because of the influence it had on him and his teaching. As another speaker at the conference put it, you can take the man out of Orkney, but you can't take Orkney out of the man. Oh, we seem to have lost Eric.
No, I missed my cue. I apologise. That was an absolutely fascinating topic, and it was brought alive with the story and fundamental theological passion of the man. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. This is actually a topic and a debate that I've had many times throughout my life, and including with myself, if I'm honest. I've had it in various locations and situations, and the most dangerous of those are in public houses. I continue to find it most stimulating, but to be honest, it's unsolvable in my mind. I have a question to get going. Is, in your experience or view, do different modern cultures around the world, do they approach and address this topic differently?
That's interesting. If that's for me first, there's this fundamental difference. I guess there's a fundamental image of religion which is about authority, and then we have the picture of Galileo as science challenging authority. But actually, you find in many areas of science now, number of writers writing in science actually speak with a great deal of authority and appeal to authority. Now, so the fundamental question is, do you approach from the top downwards, or do you approach building up from the bottom upwards, which was the Cartesian method? Well, strangely, in some religions, you actually do find doubt. For example, in Buddhism, the Buddha actually told his followers, doubt everything and doubt me as well. In other words, he wanted them to question and challenge everything. So what he was saying was very similar to the Cartesian method about doubting and testing, which is the foundation for science.
Yes, I've got an interesting comment here from YouTube. I've never heard of John Oman. Thank you. I think Orkney schools need to mention more of the great Arcadians and the pioneering folk of Orkney. Now, interestingly, you showed a picture of the house, the croft, and another comment was, little seems to have changed in Orkney physically, but is this the same for socially and spiritually in modern Orkney?
I'm not sure what they mean about not a lot having changed. It depends what aspects you're looking at, but certainly the farmer Begins has entirely changed. The old building is unfortunately entirely gone. But it's the fascinating thing you can do now with the internet. You can find out, put more of these stories together. A lot of these professors were known about, and if you read the old books, which not so many people read, but it was when I started using the internet to find these stories. This was one of the first ones I came across. These professors whose names I knew, sort of John Bewes, Robert Wallace, James Drever, and so on, they seemed very much in the past. But I was struck how many mentions there are of John Oman among theologians now. And it makes me realize how these professors 100 years ago, the influences they have had. And it is an opportunity we have now we never had before to put these stories together. So I mentioned that my website's called About Orkney, and the story of quite a few of them is on there. And I'm hoping to get to more there. I should also mention that there is a book being written about John Oman by Fleur Houston. Hopefully it'll be out in a couple of years, and promises to be very interesting in looking at his the thing that I've only barely touched on, how his Orkney upbringing and so on, how that fed into his thinking. And, so there's lots of stories still to come, and hopefully we'll get them into the schools.
Yeah. I can detect your passion for this, Patricia. It comes over so strongly. Is John Oman's story very unusual, or are there other parallels in other figures in Orkney?
I would say, Howie, I suppose that's a question for us both, but no, it's not terribly unusual. Of course, you need opportunity, and he was very fortunate in that he had such an enterprising father. So they could afford to send the children off to university. One of his brothers, in fact, ended up in Madagascar and was a businessman there, and so on. So, but there were scholarships and so on as well. There are others, John Bewes, it was scholarships that got him from the Scapa School to be a professor of botany and Dean in Natal and so on. So but lots of other ones, like my own grandfather, who certainly could have been an academic, but there was no opportunity. The education was there. There were lots of schools here before compulsory education. It's not universal, but certainly widespread. But you just needed to be able to afford to take it further.
This one's for Howie. John Oman describes being lost on a landscape with no distinct features. He's assured of a safe return and asks, what guidance are you trusting? The Orkney dialect term for being lost in fog is wild, which indicates that mind will take over when all other physical things fail. Is this Orcadian wisdom coming through?
Oh, that's a beautiful thought, a beautiful comment. Very, very well put. All I could say is I much appreciate that. I much agree with what's being said. And just to add that this is one of the wonderful things about John Oman's writing, really very powerful, that he expresses abstract ideas in terms of very tangible and rather beautifully described scenes and situations that are familiar to us all from our own experience. But I do like that comment.
Okay. This is a comment from Peter. A wonderful talk. I hadn't heard of him, much to my shame, although I frequently attended Westminster College. It was where the Cambridge Rotary Club met. I will now seek him out. Well, there you go. You've already had an impact on someone trying to search for more. Here's one from Bill. Did John get hassle from scientists in Cambridge?
How interesting. One of them, in fact, Pat maybe could come in on that too, because one of the things I was going to say here is that he was in the strange position that because he's a theologian, scientists aren't actually going to be likely to read him. But equally well, because he's writing about the relationship between theology and science, it can be sometimes difficult then for theologians to necessarily want to follow the direction he's going. So paradoxically, by looking at that broader picture to unify the two into an overall framework, he can sometimes find himself on a kind of boundary line between the two. But Pat could maybe say something about reactions directly.
I don't know what happened at the time. I do remember a couple that I met here who had come up to, there were ministers in Wales, I think, that had come to do some work in Caithness purely to give them the chance to come across to Orkney and see where John Oman grew up. And I asked them why he was still of such interest. And they said that he was the first theologian to really take on the challenge posed by the Enlightenment. So this is perhaps why he is still certainly read in, and why there was a conference about him. Yes, I think you're quite right to say he probably does fall between the two, and it's one of the reasons he's not known in the wider world.
Now, Julia has indicated, Patricia, that you have said that John Oman was not a good preacher, but a good minister. What made him a good minister then?
Several parishioners are quoted as saying that although they recognised that his great mind and so on, that he was also very approachable. They found a friend in him. He took a great interest in his parishioners and he visited Ennick many times after he'd left it. He also saw the study group, the young people study group, as one of the great challenges, like trying to get across his ideas, which perhaps is how he came to be so good at coming up with images. There's the one where he's talking about how God loves rivers, so why should you assume that his sort of other methods is like a canal, and so on. So he said that it was one of the hardest things of his ministry was trying to do the young people, this Bible study group, but many of them are quoted as saying that it made a lasting impression on them. So it's his deep interest in people, I think, is how he was a good minister without necessarily being a talented preacher.
Yeah, no, I get that. That's a good explanation. Here's one. It's aimed at Howie, but I'm pretty sure, Patricia, you'll have a view on this one. If people are interested in John Oman's approach to theology and science, are there any writings of Oman's available anywhere? What would you suggest? And if he was such an influential theologian of his day, how is it that even here in Orkney, not many have heard of him?
Well, his books, I see several of them are still available. They're in print. You can see them in Amazon, the ones we've mentioned. So, and I think some of them you can read online. The one I mentioned that came out of the conference is this one, John Oman, the New Perspectives. And it was a very good introduction, I felt. It had several quotes. It's papers from the conference and covers a range of things. So yes, if you want to seek it out, it is quite easy to find his things. I confess, I have not read my way through his books myself, that they have the reputation for some of them being perhaps a little challenging for the non-theologian. But as I said, I would say the New Perspectives book is a place to start, and it's certainly readily available.
Excellent.
And what about, Pat, what about Stephen Bevan's book, the one that you mentioned as well?
Yes.
Would that maybe be a good starting point, because that's the one with
Yes.
the portrait, because it's biographical as well as, and it's in kind of bite-sized pieces, the theology.
Yes, and in fact, the professor who suggested the PhD to him came to Orkney last year, and I showed him where Biggins was. It was so there is interest in him on the other side of the Atlantic still. So yeah, but it's quite understandable that, well, I imagine few Orcadians could name the other professors either. It's something they have slipped away. So they were famous in their day, more or less, in Orkney, as most of them kept links with their with Orkney. But
yeah, I have one last, and this is my challenge. It's something that you said, Howie, and it got the bristles on my neck going. I would challenge that science looks only backward. Yes, initially perhaps, but then you extrapolate and explore new and potential greater options and opportunity.
You know, I think that's fair. I did wonder about that bit, about the backward and the forward. I guess what he was talking about was that science is working around or to make things known, but then the idea of science is to explore the unknown and make it known. So yeah, that I do agree. I think where he was particularly strong was that phrase, beneath the meaning, beyond the world's meaning, when he was saying that the aim of theology was to look at the meaning. So science in a way makes discoveries, some marvelous discoveries, but theology has to look at the meaning. And it's interesting actually that in the area of quantum theory, interpretations of quantum theory, which really desperately needs philosophy. There are brilliant mathematicians and brilliant experimenters, but a big lack of philosophy, that some of the interesting people in quantum theory are saying there's a need to start looking for the meaning in the mathematics. So it's interesting, looking for meaning. And I think that's the part of it where he speaks about science, looking for meaning, where I think he's totally on target.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Now, we've come to that time, I'm afraid, where I'm going to have to stop any more discussion. Seriously, Patricia, Howie, thank you so much for a very, very interesting presentation and debate. It's been absolutely wonderful. I need to thank Julia and all the speakers. Thank you to everyone in the audience for participating. And I'm going to thank our technical team behind the scenes. Too many to mention right now, but I know they've had their work cut out with this particular one. Our next talk will be today after the Kirkwall City Pipe Band event, and it will start at 8 p.m. this evening. Join us then to hear Dr. Edvard Kobal from the Slovenian Science Foundation talk about I Knew the Vines Have Fruited. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that there are also still spaces available for the PD Kirk lunches this week, and also at our evening festival club table sessions. If you'd like to relax around one of our virtual tables and meet some of the festival speakers, do register and join us for the lunches. The links can be found in the description below each PD Kirk lunch event on the festival's website. We'd also like to invite you to the festival club tonight and are sharing the link in the live chat now. Please copy it and come along tonight. I can say from experience that it is truly great fun. If you're enjoying the festival, please do like us on our Facebook page and follow our YouTube channel. For now, good afternoon and goodbye.